It was a quiet, seemingly ordinary flight from New York to Los Angeles, but for one man, this journey would mark a turning point in his life. In the first-class cabin, nestled between the plush seats and cozy pillows, the man sat comfortably, sipping his overpriced champagne and flicking through a magazine. He had no idea who sat next to him, his focus entirely on the pages in front of him. The man glanced up for just a moment, catching sight of his seatmate. He was a large figure, broad shoulders filling the space, wearing dark sunglasses despite the dim cabin lighting. The man felt a strange twinge of unease, something about the quiet, confident aura of the stranger seemed out of place. But he quickly dismissed it. The stranger wasn't anyone important, just another big guy on a flight. The man, feeling secure in his own arrogance, made a joke to break the silence. He snickered to himself as he leaned over slightly to the stranger. "Basketball players, huh? It's crazy how some of those guys look like they've been built in a lab, like Shaquille O'Neal. How do they even fit into these seats?" The stranger didn't react immediately. The man's words hung in the air, a mild insult disguised as humor, but his seatmate only shifted slightly. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to keep talking. "Big guy, small plane," the man added with a laugh, clearly proud of his wit. "Shaq might need 2 seats just to get comfortable." He waited for a reaction, a chuckle, or at least some sort of acknowledgement that his joke had landed. Instead, the stranger remained eerily quiet, only offering a soft grunt in response. A few minutes passed, and the man returned to his magazine, convinced the interaction had been harmless. He didn't know that the person beside him wasn't just some random traveler. He didn't know that his casual insult was about to lead to something much more unexpected. It wasn't until the stranger leaned forward slightly, taking off his sunglasses, that the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. The man froze, his face turning pale as he recognized the familiar features, the large, imposing frame, the piercing eyes, the iconic smile. The stranger wasn't just any big guy. It was Shaquille O'Neal. The shock in the man's eyes was palpable. He had just insulted the NBA legend, one of the greatest basketball players in history, and worse yet, he had done it without even realizing it. The words he had casually thrown out now felt like poison, and the weight of regret slammed into him. Shaquille O'Neal smiled, but there was something different about his expression. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was calm, too calm. The man felt his stomach twist into knots. He fumbled for something to say, but the words caught in his throat. His face flushed with embarrassment, but all he could manage was a nervous chuckle. "Well, I didn't mean. I mean, it's just a joke, you know." Shaquille O'Neal's smile remained, but there was no sign of irritation in his eyes. It was as if the big man had heard this kind of thing 1,000 times before and had learned to brush it off with ease. Yet, there was a silent tension in the air, one that was palpable. The man's palms started to sweat, and his mind raced, trying to figure out how to fix this, how to apologize for his careless words. But Shaquille O'Neal didn't say a word. He simply sat back, as if waiting for the man to come to a realization on his own. The silence stretched on, making the man's discomfort grow with every passing second. What had he done? How could he have been so thoughtless, so casual with his words? The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly as the man sat there, now hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the cabin. The subtle hum of the airplane, the soft rustling of magazines, the faint clinking of glasses, all of it felt like a distant noise compared to the pounding of his own heartbeat. He was acutely aware of his mistake, but what made the situation worse was that Shaquille O'Neal hadn't said a word. He hadn't reacted in anger, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand an apology. He just sat there, staring ahead, completely unfazed, almost as if the insult didn't matter to him at all. It was the calmness in Shaquille's demeanor that slowly began to unsettle the man. The more he thought about it, the more he realized who he had just mocked, an NBA legend, a man who had dominated courts all over the world, a true icon of strength and sportsmanship. "Why am I sitting here like an idiot?" the man thought to himself. "I just insulted one of the greatest athletes of all time, and he's acting like it's nothing." The man's mind raced as he tried to recall his earlier words. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was a dig at Shaquille's size, his very presence, which was something that had made the man uncomfortable from the start. The giant frame of the basketball star, sitting in the same first-class cabin, was not something the man had been used to. And in his discomfort, he had made a joke at Shaquille's expense. Now, as he glanced at Shaquille again, he saw the quiet power in his presence. There was no sign of annoyance, no sign of anger, not even a hint of challenge. Shaquille just sat there, looking ahead as though the world outside didn't exist, waiting. The man felt like the biggest fool. "So, you're Shaq, huh?" the man said, his voice faltering, the weight of his realization pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. I didn't mean to insult you. It was just, a bad joke. I didn't know it was you." Shaquille O'Neal turned slightly to face him, his expression unreadable. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It happens." The man blinked, stunned. "It happens," he repeated, the words almost sounding foreign to him. How does that happen?" "You've probably heard people say stuff like that a million times." Shaquille nodded slowly. "Yeah, I have. But I've learned something over the years. Some people talk because they're afraid of what they don't understand." The words hit the man harder than he could have anticipated. For a moment, he couldn't respond. All he could think about was how his joke, something he'd said without thinking, was a reflection of something deeper, something about his own discomfort with people who were different, people who didn't fit into the narrow boxes that he had drawn for others in his mind. The silence between them grew longer, and the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was as though Shaquille's simple words had opened a door in his mind, one that he didn't know was there before. He had thought of Shaquille O'Neal as just another basketball player, another famous face. But now, sitting next to him, he realized how little he understood about the man himself, about his journey, and about the strength it must have taken for someone like Shaquille to rise above the judgments, the mockery, and the expectations. "I never meant it like that," the man muttered, now genuinely apologetic. I just didn't know." Shaquille O'Neal smiled softly, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made the man feel better. It wasn't a patronizing smile, nor was it an angry one. It was a smile that spoke of years of experience, of wisdom, of having seen it all and learned to keep moving forward despite the ignorance of others. "It's all right. People can only give you what they have inside them," Shaquille said. "Sometimes, it's not about what you say, but how you choose to react to the things said to you. You'll learn that in time." The man nodded slowly, feeling smaller and smaller with each word. He didn't know what to say next. Shaquille had taken something that could have escalated, something that could have led to confrontation, and turned it into a moment of reflection. It was as if he had given the man a glimpse of something bigger than just an apology. It was a lesson in how to be better, how to move past hurtful words and see beyond the surface. He stared at his lap, unable to look Shaquille in the eye. "I'm really sorry," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I didn't understand." Shaquille didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, taking a sip of his drink, and the man sat in silence, realizing that in this moment, the apology was more than just words, it was a chance to change. But he had no idea just how much this brief encounter would shift the course of his life. The flight continued, the world outside unchanged, but inside, the man felt as though something had already begun to change. Shaquille O'Neal had shown him something he never expected. He had shown him the power of humility, the power of choosing peace over pride. The man's mind raced as he thought about what Shaquille had said. He hadn't just apologized. He had begun to question his own life, his own choices, and the way he viewed others. He had made a joke at the expense of someone he didn't know, and now he realized just how much that joke reflected the narrow, judgmental parts of himself. And there, in the quiet of the first-class cabin, he knew that something deep inside him had begun to shift. But what would he do with this newfound knowledge? He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for Shaquille, not just because of his fame or his success, but because of the quiet wisdom he exuded. Here he was, this larger-than-life figure, and yet his strength wasn't in his size or his accomplishments, it was in his ability to remain calm and grounded, even in the face of mockery and doubt. The man shifted in his seat, still uneasy but feeling something inside him stir. It wasn't just guilt anymore, it was something deeper, something that made him question his own life choices. He had spent so much of his life focusing on appearances, on outward strength, but now, sitting next to Shaquille, he realized that true power came from within. "I guess I've been looking at it all wrong," the man admitted, his voice softer now, more introspective. "I've always thought that if I fought hard enough, if I pushed back, I'd get respect. But now I see that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, by how you carry yourself, by how you respond to life." Shaquille nodded, his smile widening. "Exactly. People will always talk. They'll always have something to say. But at the end of the day, it's about the man in the mirror. If you can look at yourself and know you've done right, that's all the respect you need." The man sat back, the weight of those words settling in. He realized that this was more than just a conversation, it was a lesson in life that he would carry with him long after the flight ended. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was seeing things clearly, like a veil had been lifted, revealing a new way of thinking. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the man glanced at Shaquille once more. This time, instead of feeling small or foolish, he felt something different. He felt grateful. Grateful for the unexpected encounter, for the opportunity to learn from someone who had been through so much and still remained humble, calm, and unshaken by the world's judgments. "Thank you," the man said quietly, his voice sincere. "I don't think you'll ever know how much this conversation has meant to me." Shaquille didn't respond with a boastful remark or a claim of wisdom. He simply nodded, as though he knew that the lesson had been received, and that was enough. The man leaned back in his seat, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The words, the wisdom, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger, Shaquille O'Neal, had opened his eyes. And from that moment forward, he knew he would never be the same. As the flight continued its course toward Los Angeles, the man found himself lost in thought, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. Shaquille O'Neal's words had left a mark, not just on his sense of self but on his very outlook on life. He had been so sure of himself before, so convinced that strength came from dominating others, from asserting control and superiority. But now, in the face of Shaquille's quiet wisdom, everything seemed to shift. What was truly important? Was it the fleeting satisfaction of winning petty battles, or was it the strength to remain calm, to choose how you responded to others, and to embrace the lessons life threw at you? The man was deep in his thoughts, barely noticing when the flight attendant passed by, offering snacks and drinks. His mind was consumed by Shaquille's words, the lesson of humility and strength that had been handed to him so unexpectedly. But as he looked out the window, lost in his contemplation, the calmness of the flight was suddenly disrupted. A loud crash reverberated through the plane. The sound, sharp and jarring, broke the silence and sent a wave of panic through the cabin. The man's heart skipped a beat as he looked around, his eyes widening in confusion and fear. The flight attendants immediately rushed to their stations, speaking calmly into their headsets. But their words were drowned out by the increasing murmurs of passengers around them. The man turned to Shaquille, who had been sitting beside him in quiet reflection, his expression unreadable. The basketball legend didn't seem alarmed in the slightest. Instead, he gave a small, reassuring nod toward the man, as if to say everything would be fine. But the man couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Another loud noise echoed through the cabin, this one more prolonged, as if the plane itself was shuddering from the inside. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and the seatbelt signs flashed on with an urgent beep. The flight attendants remained calm, but the fear in their eyes couldn't be masked. They moved quickly, attending to the passengers, directing them to fasten their seatbelts and brace for any turbulence. "What's happening?" the man asked Shaquille, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaquille turned toward him, his face stoic but calm. "Don't worry," he said softly. "It's probably just some turbulence. Happens all the time. Just stay calm and trust the crew." But the man could feel it in the air, this wasn't just turbulence. There was something more unsettling about the way the plane had jerked, the way the atmosphere seemed to shift. It was as if something had gone terribly wrong, and no one was saying it out loud. A sudden jolt made the man's stomach lurch. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles white, as his eyes searched the cabin. People were nervous now, some visibly shaken, others whispering in hushed tones, trying to comfort their loved ones. Yet through all the chaos, Shaquille remained calm, a steady presence beside him. The man turned to him once again. "Is this really just turbulence? You look so calm." Shaquille's gaze softened, and he gave a faint smile. "The world's gonna throw challenges at you, whether you're ready for them or not. It's how you handle them that counts." The man nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure how he was going to handle this. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. And then, without warning, the lights flickered out completely, leaving the cabin bathed in complete darkness. The man's heart raced. Panic rose in his chest, but he did his best to breathe deeply, trying to recall Shaquille's words. "Stay calm. Stay calm." Just then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow over the cabin. The sounds of the passengers' anxious voices filled the air, but it was Shaquille's calm demeanor that somehow managed to steady the man's nerves. A voice came over the intercom, but it was crackled and distorted. The flight attendants continued to move quickly, helping passengers, checking seatbelts, and doing what they could to reassure everyone. The plane wasn't descending, but the strange noises continued, rattling the nerves of even the most seasoned travelers. The man clutched the armrest again, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He couldn't tell if the situation was as bad as it felt or if the anxiety was getting the best of him. But one thing was certain, things had taken an unexpected turn. And he wasn't prepared for this. Shaquille, still calm, turned to him once more. "Whatever happens, remember this, you can't control everything. You can only control how you react. No matter how dark it gets, don't lose your head. Keep your focus. Stay steady." The man nodded again, swallowing his fear. He wasn't sure if it was Shaquille's words or the sheer presence of the man beside him that was keeping him grounded. But he couldn't deny that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just focused on his own panic. He was trying to listen, to understand, and to take the advice to heart. The plane jolted again, and this time the sound of the engines grew louder, like a low growl that sent a chill down the man's spine. Something was happening, something serious. And he knew he couldn't afford to lose his composure now. This was more than a chance to understand the true meaning of strength, it was a test of everything Shaquille had just shared with him. As the flight attendants hurried about, trying to restore order and calm the passengers, the man felt his fear begin to shift. It wasn't gone completely, but with Shaquille's guidance, it became something he could control. He wasn't the man he had been before the flight, not the man who made careless jokes, mocked others, or let fear dictate his actions. No, this man was learning, adapting, and for once, listening. The chaos continued, but for the first time, the man had a strange sense of peace. He wasn't sure how the flight would end or what the future held, but one thing was clear, the journey he had started had already changed him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. All he had to do now was hold on, physically and emotionally, and trust that the calmness he had been shown was enough to get him through. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. The plane continued its bumpy journey through the sky, the rattling of the engines and the occasional jolt of turbulence keeping everyone on edge. The emergency lights flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows over the cabin. The man's heart still raced, but Shaquille remained a steady presence beside him. He had stopped asking questions. There was nothing more to say, nothing to do but ride out the uncertainty and focus on staying calm, just as Shaquille had said. The man glanced at the basketball legend. Shaquille O'Neal's calm demeanor never wavered, even as the flight attendants continued to move through the aisles, trying to keep everything under control. They spoke softly to the passengers, their voices almost drowned out by the muffled sounds of the plane's engines and the anxious murmurs of the other travelers. In the midst of all this, the man couldn't help but think about what had brought him to this point. It wasn't just the turbulence in the air that had him on edge, it was the turbulence in his own life. The man had spent so many years focused on trivial things, mocking others to make himself feel superior, chasing after fleeting successes, and believing that strength was measured by dominance. He had never truly taken a step back and asked himself what really mattered. Now, sitting beside Shaquille, with the strange chaos of the plane outside, the man found himself reflecting on his own choices, his actions, and his mistakes. The way he had mocked Shaquille earlier now felt like a painful reminder of how shallow he had been. How many times had he done the same thing in his life, made quick judgments, said careless words, acted without thinking? It was all so clear to him now, but it hadn't been before. He remembered the time he had made fun of a colleague at work, someone he considered weaker and less capable. He had mocked him in front of others to get a laugh, never considering how that person might have felt. Now, the man thought back to that moment with regret. He had hurt someone for his own amusement, just as he had hurt Shaquille, and just as he had done to others countless times before. Why did I always feel the need to put others down to lift myself up? The man wondered, feeling a tightness in his chest. It was a pattern he had never really questioned until now. In the face of this turbulence, in the uncertainty of the situation, he realized just how much he had missed out on, how much he had failed to see because of his own arrogance. Shaquille's calm presence beside him was teaching him something crucial. The ability to remain steady in the face of adversity. The power of silence over shouting, of reflection over reaction. The strength that came from controlling your thoughts and emotions, instead of letting them control you. The man took a deep breath, his mind still reeling. He had been angry at the world for so long, angry at his own failures, at the things he couldn't control. But sitting here, in this strange moment of crisis, he realized that maybe the real enemy wasn't the world around him. Maybe it was the anger inside himself, the resentment he had carried with him for years. As the turbulence subsided for a moment, the man glanced around the cabin. The passengers, while still uneasy, seemed to have settled into a strange, tentative calm. The flight attendants had resumed their duties, moving through the aisles with a quiet confidence that, although a little shaken, was rooted in experience. They had been through this before. And the man realized that this was the key to surviving whatever challenges life threw at him: calmness, experience, and the wisdom to understand that not everything was in his control. Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had faced his own battles in the public eye, from the court to the media, seemed to embody this wisdom. He had risen above the noise of criticism, mockery, and doubt. He had learned not to be shaken by the world's judgments. And in doing so, he had gained the kind of strength that wasn't about size or power, it was about knowing who you were, no matter what others thought. The man turned to Shaquille, who was still sitting beside him, looking out the window as the plane steadied once more. He had to ask the question that had been on his mind ever since the flight had turned chaotic. "How do you do it?" the man asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and genuine curiosity. How do you stay so calm, no matter what's happening around you? Shaquille's gaze shifted back to the man, his face softening. You know, it wasn't always like this for me, he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of vulnerability that the man hadn't expected. When I was younger, I was angry all the time. I didn't know how to deal with people mocking me, judging me, or doubting me. I thought fighting back, being tough, was the answer. But over time, I realized that the real strength comes from within. When you stop fighting the world and start understanding it, you find peace. Peace doesn't come from controlling everything around you, it comes from accepting what you can't change and making the best of what you can. The man listened intently, hanging on every word. It wasn't the kind of advice he had expected from a celebrity like Shaquille. It was raw, real, and deeply human. Shaquille had struggled too. He had fought his battles, but now, he had chosen a different path. The man wondered how many people, including himself, had been stuck in the same cycle of anger and resistance. I've spent my whole life pushing against things, the man admitted, his voice tinged with regret. Pushing against people, against situations, against things I couldn't control. I thought that was what you were supposed to do. But now, sitting here, I see it doesn't work. Shaquille nodded, his expression soft but firm. It's hard, though, to let go. But sometimes, the hardest thing to do is also the most powerful. It's about finding peace with yourself, first and foremost. Once you do that, everything else falls into place. But it starts with understanding who you are, and knowing that your worth doesn't depend on what others say about you. The man nodded slowly, feeling a sense of understanding wash over him. He had spent so much time seeking validation from others, trying to prove himself, trying to control everything around him. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to realize that the only validation he needed was his own. He looked out the window, the turbulence now a distant memory, and felt a strange calm settle in his chest. No matter what happened next, no matter how the rest of the flight went, he knew that something inside him had changed. And in that moment, he knew he would never be the same. The flight had steadied, and the unsettling noise that had gripped the plane had diminished. The once tense atmosphere among the passengers seemed to ease, but for the man, the turbulence was far from over. Inside, the storm of regret and realization still raged. The conversation with Shaquille had planted a seed in his mind, but the deeper he dug, the more he saw just how much he had taken for granted in his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more than simply sit back and accept what had happened. He had to take responsibility for his words, for the harm he had caused with that careless joke. Shaquille had been calm, understanding, and above all, wise. But that wasn't enough. The man had to make things right, not just for Shaquille, but for himself. This was his chance to truly make a change, to confront the ugliness of his own actions and seek redemption. The idea of an apology had been floating in his mind ever since the first uncomfortable moment of realization, but now, sitting in the quiet of the cabin, it felt like an urgent necessity. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this interaction without offering something more than awkward words. He needed to show Shaquille that he had truly understood, that he had learned something important in these few hours. But how could he do it? What could he say to make it right? His mind swirled with the possibilities, each one more complicated than the last. He couldn't undo the insult. There was no magic phrase that would suddenly erase the foolishness of his earlier words. But perhaps, if he chose his words carefully, he could at least show Shaquille that he genuinely regretted them. With a deep breath, the man turned to Shaquille, who was still seated next to him, now casually flipping through a book. The calmness that radiated from the NBA star was like a steady anchor in the midst of the man's turmoil. "Shaq," the man began, his voice low but clear. Shaquille didn't look up at first, but when he heard the seriousness in the man's tone, he set his book aside and turned to face him. His gaze was patient, almost like he had been waiting for this moment all along. "I owe you an apology," the man said, his voice filled with sincerity. I didn't just insult you with a stupid joke. I insulted you as a person. And I've been sitting here thinking about it, trying to figure out how I could make it right. But I don't think there's a way to undo the damage. Shaquille nodded, his expression unchanged but soft. He didn't interrupt, letting the man find his own words. I've spent so much of my life acting like I'm superior to others. Judging people for their differences, making jokes to make myself feel better, not understanding how much my words could hurt. I was arrogant, and I can see that now. I'm not proud of it. The man paused, swallowing against the lump that had formed in his throat. Sometimes, we get so caught up in ourselves that we forget how much damage we can do just by opening our mouths. I did that to you, and I'm sorry. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, there was nothing but the low hum of the airplane and the sound of the man's own breathing. He felt vulnerable, raw, as if he had stripped away a layer of pride he didn't even know he had been carrying. But in that vulnerability, he also felt lighter, as if the apology was the first real step toward changing the person he wanted to be. Shaquille remained silent for a few moments, his gaze steady and contemplative. The man braced himself for anything, a dismissive gesture, a quick, "It's fine," or even a sharp rebuke. But what Shaquille said next was not at all what he had expected. "It's okay," Shaquille said, his voice deep but warm. "I've been there too. I've said things I didn't mean. I've hurt people without even realizing it. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that you're owning up to it now, and that's something a lot of people never do. So, thank you for that." The man blinked, surprised by the kindness in Shaquille's words. He had braced himself for something harsher, but instead, Shaquille had given him a gift, the chance to learn, to grow, and to let go of his own guilt. "Thank you," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll never forget this. I promise, I won't make the same mistake again." Shaquille smiled, a genuine smile that made the man feel like he had been forgiven not just for the insult, but for the years of thoughtlessness he had carried with him. "Just remember this," Shaquille added, leaning back in his seat, "it's never too late to change. Every day's a new opportunity to be better. You just have to choose to take it." The man nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical temperature of the cabin and everything to do with the sudden clarity he felt in his heart. As the plane continued its journey, the man sat back in his seat, a strange peace settling over him. He had apologized. He had faced his mistake, owned up to it, and sought to make things right. And in doing so, he had taken the first real step toward a better version of himself. The turbulence had passed, both in the skies and within him. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. Shaquille's words echoed in his mind, "It's never too late to change." And he believed it, because in that moment, he had already begun. The remainder of the flight was smooth, the tension in the cabin finally dissipating. The emergency lights had turned off, and the normal hum of the engines resumed as if nothing had happened. The passengers, once on edge, had settled back into their seats, returning to the routine of a long flight. But for the man, everything had changed. His thoughts were no longer consumed with the fear of turbulence or the uncertainty of what was to come. He was focused on the unexpected lesson he had learned from a man he had once mocked, Shaquille O'Neal. As the minutes passed, the man found himself reflecting not just on the apology he had made, but on the entire conversation that had followed. What Shaquille had shared with him wasn't just about how to handle insults or mockery, it was about a philosophy of life, of approaching every situation with calm, patience, and wisdom. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Shaquille's words weren't just aimed at him in that moment, they were lessons for life. The man shifted in his seat, his eyes still focused ahead, but his mind was somewhere far away, contemplating the depth of Shaquille's wisdom. The idea that strength wasn't about brute force, wasn't about pushing others down or proving your superiority, it was about staying steady, being humble, and choosing not to engage with negativity. The weight of these realizations hit him hard, like a floodgate had opened in his mind. He thought back to all the years he had spent in a cycle of arrogance, judgment, and resistance. It was a cycle he had never even questioned. He had believed that challenging people, winning arguments, and putting others in their place would make him feel powerful. But now, sitting on a plane with Shaquille O'Neal, he realized that true power wasn't found in confrontation, it was found in control over one's own reactions. The man glanced at Shaquille again. He couldn't help but wonder about the experiences that had shaped him, the trials and tribulations he had faced on and off the court. He wondered how many moments of mockery and judgment Shaquille had endured in his life, how many times people had doubted him, criticized him, or tried to tear him down. And yet, despite it all, Shaquille had managed to rise above it. He hadn't let others dictate his self-worth. What was it like? The man asked softly, not entirely sure if Shaquille would want to share, but feeling the need to ask. How did you learn to rise above everything? The criticism, the doubters. Shaquille's eyes shifted toward him, and for the first time, the man saw a flicker of something deeper, a kind of nostalgia, as if Shaquille was remembering a part of his past that wasn't always easy to revisit. It wasn't always easy, Shaquille said, his voice calm, but with a weight of experience behind it. There were times I wanted to quit, times I wanted to fight back, times I felt like the world was against me. But over the years, I realized something important. You can't change how people see you, but you can change how you see yourself. The only opinion that matters is your own. The man nodded slowly, absorbing the words. I never thought about it like that. I always thought that the world's opinion was the only thing that mattered. Shaquille gave him a small smile. We all start there. But eventually, you learn that it's not the world's opinion that defines you. It's your own actions, your choices, and how you treat others. That's the only real power you have. For the first time, the man felt like he understood. He had spent so much of his life focused on external validation, on proving himself to the world, that he had never stopped to ask what kind of person he was deep down. Was he someone who could rise above his impulses, someone who could treat others with respect even in the face of criticism? Was he someone who could choose humility over arrogance? He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he had already begun the journey toward becoming the person he wanted to be. And this flight, this unexpected encounter with Shaquille O'Neal, had been the catalyst for that change. The plane began its descent, the distant lights of Los Angeles visible below. The man felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The turbulence, the fear, the discomfort, it all seemed so distant now. The real challenge, he realized, wasn't the flight or the chaos that had unfolded. The real challenge was within him. It was about choosing how he reacted, about choosing to be better every day, even when the world around him felt uncertain. As the plane touched down and the fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, the man stood up slowly, still processing everything that had happened. He turned to Shaquille, who was already preparing to exit the plane with his usual calm grace. Thank you, the man said again, his voice filled with gratitude. You've taught me more than I can explain in just a few hours. I don't think I'll ever forget this. Shaquille nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. It's not about what I taught you, it's about what you choose to do with it, he said. Remember, you don't need anyone's approval. You just need to live true to yourself. The man walked down the jet bridge, his steps lighter than they had been when he boarded. The world outside seemed a little less daunting now, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was ready to face it, not by fighting it, but by accepting it and choosing to be better. And as he left the airport, he knew that this moment, this lesson, would stay with him long after the flight ended. The days that followed the flight were filled with new realizations. The man went about his routine, but now everything felt different. The simple actions he took every day, his interactions with colleagues, his reactions to stress, the way he viewed the people around him, had all changed. It wasn't just the big moments that made a difference now, but the small choices, the quiet decisions he made when no one was watching. He couldn't stop thinking about Shaquille's words, "You don't need anyone's approval. You just need to live true to yourself." They echoed in his mind constantly, reminding him to check himself before reacting, to stay grounded in moments of frustration, and to always lead with respect. At work, the man found himself in a difficult meeting one afternoon. His colleague, who had often challenged his ideas in the past, started to push back on one of his proposals. In the past, this would have been a point of pride for him, a moment to assert his authority, to prove he was right. But now, something in him shifted. Instead of quickly defending his point or trying to overpower the conversation, he paused. He looked at his colleague, listened to what they had to say, and asked questions to understand their perspective better. It was a subtle change, but it made all the difference. By the end of the meeting, the two were collaborating on new ideas, sharing insights, and coming to a mutual understanding. The man realized that he didn't need to fight for every point. Sometimes, the real strength was in simply listening. His relationships with others also began to shift. He found himself more present with people, less concerned with what they thought of him and more focused on how he could support them. There was no longer the constant pressure to be the loudest or the most dominant in the room. He began to embrace the quiet confidence that Shaquille had demonstrated. One evening, he was having dinner with a friend, and the conversation shifted toward a mutual acquaintance, a person they both knew, but neither had truly understood. The old version of the man would have joined in with the gossip, making judgments and throwing in sarcastic comments. But instead, he paused, thinking back to his conversation with Shaquille. He realized that his words, even in casual conversations, could have a lasting impact. "Do you think we've ever misunderstood him?" the man asked his friend, genuinely curious. His friend looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Well," the man began, "maybe we've been too quick to judge him. We've never really asked him about his side, have we? Maybe there's more to his story than we know." The conversation shifted, and for the first time, they saw their acquaintance in a different light, not as an object of judgment, but as a person with their own struggles and experiences. It was another subtle shift in the man's thinking, another moment where he chose not to engage in the negativity that had once defined his interactions. He began to see the world with a new perspective, a place full of people, all with their own stories, struggles, and strengths. He realized that no one was defined by the mistakes of their past, and everyone had the potential to change. And just as he had learned to change, he began to believe that others could too. The man's relationship with Shaquille remained in the back of his mind, a quiet but constant reminder of the lesson he had learned. He often thought about the moment on the plane when Shaquille had shared his wisdom, when he had so calmly faced the mockery and the judgment without flinching. It wasn't about being perfect, the man realized. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about how you handled them, how you chose to grow from them. And it was about taking responsibility, not just for the things you said, but for the things you did, how you treated people, and how you showed up in the world. In the weeks that followed, the man began to let go of his old patterns. The arrogance and pride that had once clouded his decisions started to fade. He found himself stepping into conversations with a sense of humility, respecting the voices of others, and appreciating the diversity of thoughts, opinions, and perspectives around him. His transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always easy. There were moments when his old self tried to resurface, when the urge to prove himself or defend his ego came rushing back. But each time, he took a deep breath, and remembered what he had learned. He chose to rise above, to stay steady, to stay humble. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but he also knew that he was better equipped to handle whatever came his way. He had learned the most important lesson of all. That real strength was in his ability to adapt, to grow, and to be true to himself, no matter what others thought. As he sat quietly one evening, reflecting on everything he had learned, he realized that Shaquille O'Neal had given him more than just a moment of wisdom on that plane. He had given him the gift of a new beginning. A chance to be a better version of himself. And that, the man understood, was something he could carry with him for the rest of his life. Months had passed since the flight with Shaquille O'Neal, and the man had slowly begun to see the transformation within himself. The lessons he had learned from that brief but powerful encounter had changed the way he viewed the world, the way he interacted with others, and most importantly, the way he viewed himself. He was no longer the man driven by arrogance or the need for validation. Instead, he was someone who embraced humility, who found strength in stillness, and who learned to approach life with a calmness he had never known before. It was a rainy afternoon when the man stood in front of his bathroom mirror, getting ready for work. He paused for a moment, studying his reflection. He no longer saw a man struggling to prove his worth to the world, but a person who had learned to accept his flaws and embrace the opportunity to grow every day. The old version of him would have been consumed by the idea of impressing others, always worried about how others saw him. But now, standing there, he realized that none of that mattered anymore. He had come to understand that the only person he truly needed to answer to was himself. As the man went about his day, his interactions with others had taken on a new depth. His colleagues, who once knew him as someone quick to defend his ideas and his pride, now saw a different side of him. He was more open, more willing to listen, and more accepting of differing viewpoints. When conflicts arose, instead of reacting with frustration or anger, he responded with patience and understanding. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the most dominant, it was about guiding others with kindness, respecting their perspectives, and helping them feel valued. One evening, he found himself at a family gathering, sitting around the dinner table with relatives he hadn't seen in a long time. The conversation quickly turned to someone who wasn't present. A distant cousin who had recently made some poor decisions and had been the subject of gossip. In the past, the man might have joined in, adding his own judgments or sarcastic comments to the conversation. But now, as he listened to the gossip, he felt a pang of discomfort. He thought back to Shaquille O'Neal's words, "You can't change how people see you, but you can change how you see yourself." He realized that the judgment being passed wasn't helping anyone, it was just fueling negativity. It was in that moment that he made a decision. "I think we should give him a chance to explain himself," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "None of us know what he's been through. Maybe he's struggling, and maybe he's made mistakes, but that doesn't mean we should write him off." The room fell silent for a moment. His family members looked at him in surprise. For years, he had been the one to join in the gossip, the one to make jokes and pass judgment. But now, he had chosen a different path, a path of understanding and compassion. His cousin's situation wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, but the man knew that the way they spoke about him could make a difference. It was in their power to choose kindness over judgment, to offer support rather than condemnation. The evening ended quietly, but the man couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts, it was about the small, everyday decisions to be better, to do better, and to show up with respect for others. He had learned that the key to a meaningful life was in the way you treated others, the way you chose to show up for them, and the way you chose to grow with them. As he walked to his car that evening, the man felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer burdened by the need for approval or the weight of past mistakes. He had learned that it was okay to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. What mattered was that you kept moving forward, with a heart full of humility and a mind open to growth. He smiled to himself as he drove home, thinking about the future. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover, but he was ready. He had learned that life wasn't about winning or proving yourself, it was about living authentically, choosing to be the best version of yourself every day, and treating others with the respect and kindness they deserved. And that, the man realized, was the true strength. It was the strength to grow, to change, and to embrace each day as an opportunity to be better than the person you were the day before. As the night fell, the man felt a quiet contentment wash over him. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would be times when he'd slip up. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. And that path, he knew, would lead him toward a future of peace, wisdom, and the kind of strength that didn't come from arrogance, but from the heart. With that thought, he turned onto his street, ready to embrace whatever life would throw his way. And whatever it was, he knew he was ready for it.